The rule of thumb that I always give to beginner modelers is to use all quads when subdivision surface modeling. In this video, I want to explain why I give that suggestion and why the real answer is a bit more nuanced than that. In this first example, I have three subdivided planes that also have the subdivision surface modifier. The first one is made up of all evenly spaced quads. The second one includes a triangle, and the third one has an n-gon. As you can see, the latter two introduce some pinching. First of all, this pinching isn't noticeable when we have a completely flat surface. So if I turn off my wireframe overlays and look at this from an angle, since this plane is completely flat, then it doesn't really matter too much. But if this were a smoother, rounder surface, or if it had to be deformed during animation, then this could cause some problems. But what I want to show you is that the advice to use all quads is a little bit odd, because when we look at the subdivided version of both the triangle and the n-gon, we actually get quads as a result. So if I turn off optimal display here and set the viewport levels to 1 on both of these, then you'll see that no matter what shape we throw at the subdivision surface modifier, the result is actually going to be all quads anyway. It's just an interesting mathematical byproduct of cutting triangles in half. And since n-gons are really just triangles under the hood and they're being triangulated before they're subdivided, no matter what we throw at the subdivision surface modifier, we're always going to end up with quads. So the problem comes not from the quads themselves, but how they flow and how they're connected to each other. Over here on the left, if we turn off optimal display and look at this with the same resolution, all of the quads just evenly flow from one side to the next. And so we can do basically anything with this mesh that we want to, and it'll look great, as long as the edge loops are following the details of what it is that we're trying to make. Over here on the right, where we originally had a triangle, we don't just have quads that flow from one side to the next, we also have two strips of quads that take a turn around the two poles in the middle. The 5-sided pole at the tip of the triangle, and the 3-sided pole where the back of the triangle was. Later on in this video, you'll see where we use this exact same pattern intentionally, so it's not inherently bad. But we do have to be careful, because if we don't intend to have details flowing in those directions, then the resulting mesh is going to look messy because we're defining details that shouldn't be there. The same thing is happening over here on the n-gon. Instead of the loops passing all the way through, they're taking a turn at all of the newly created poles. And I know you might be sick of me saying it by now, but changing the direction of loops with poles is how we create details. And if those details are intentional and support the structure that we're trying to create, then that's perfect. But if they're unintentional or accidental, and we end up creating features that we don't want, that's how we end up with bad topology. So it's not that triangles and n-gons are inherently bad, we just have to be extremely careful with how and when we use them. If you want to see an example of that, here's a plug model that I created, actually for a modeling challenge on Jordan Kane's Twitter, and he's infamous for using n-gons in subdivision surface modeling, so I wanted to give it a try. And you can see that I'm using an n-gon right over here, where the plug connects from the inside to the outside portion. If I turn off optimal display and turn down the levels, you can see how this gets subdivided so that we have a loop going up and around, defining the sharp edge of the plug, a loop that wraps all the way around the whole detail, and a loop that blends the circular part with the main body. So when subdivided, this n-gon actually creates some pretty good topology. But it's certainly a lot to think of while modeling, and I don't generally recommend it for beginners because you already have enough to think about when it comes to modeling with quads. So I generally recommend modeling with quads first, and then later on, if you want to incorporate n-gons and triangles while being aware of how they get turned into quads later, then that's also okay. It's just the next step up in complexity. So again, triangles and n-gons are not inherently evil, but a lot of the time when beginners use them, they cause problems because they're creating these unintentional details. Remember when we first talked about subdivision surface modeling, and I mentioned how one of the ways to sharpen up an edge is to add an edge loop right next to it, and how it's really the concentration of all of those extra vertices, which is what causes that pinching. And in the case of sharpening up edges, we want that pinching. Well, the same thing happens around poles. We often get areas of higher or lower mesh density, and that's what causes pinching and lumps on our models. So if I go ahead and turn up the viewport levels here on this plane all the way to 6, I don't know how well this comes across in the video, but hopefully you can see that right here in the middle, we're getting a really dense concentration of faces, and right below that we have an area of lower density. If that's not coming through in the video, then go ahead and try this out on your own. Well, just like how those areas of high density created pinching along the edges of our models, so too is this area of high density going to create pinching if this is on more of a rounded surface. Here we're not really going to see any difference because it's completely flat, and so topology doesn't matter as much. But if this was more of a rounded surface, then you'd start to see lumps. One thing to notice is that the pole that has 5 edges connected to it is the area of low density, and then the pole that gets created by the triangle that has 3 edges connected to it becomes the area with high density. And those are just inherent properties of these different types of poles. We can see the same thing when we subdivide the n-gon over here. In the middle, we're getting a pole with a lot more than 5 edges connected to it, and so that's going to be an area of very low density. Whereas we have lots of these new 3-sided poles, and those are going to be areas of high density, so if we increase the viewport levels, you can see that's exactly what's happening. On a rounded model, all of these areas of high density are likely to cause some pinching. Now, pinching isn't completely avoidable. It's just sort of a fact of subdivision surface modeling, but we can be smart about where it's happening on our model. In this example, I have a model of a husky puppy, and this is actually the exercise that I asked students to create at the end of the Mesh Modeling Bootcamp course, which is a bit older of a course, but it covers a lot of these in-depth topology topics. And on this model, you can see that we have a lot of different poles. And as we talked about in the last video, I'm using them to direct the edge loops around the details of the mesh. So we have a 5-sided pole right in the corner of the eye, and that's splitting off the loop that goes around the eyebrow to the one that goes down and towards the chin. And these 5-sided poles, as long as they're pretty evenly balanced, don't cause a lot of problems. It's only when there are 6 or more edges connected to it that they tend to start causing some pinching, and so it's generally best to avoid those if possible. But 5-sided poles are pretty common. We also have plenty of 3-sided poles just like this. And as you can see, if I turn off the wireframes, we are actually getting a little bit of bulging in that area if I increase the subdiv. But in this case, that bulging follows the anatomy, and so it actually helps our model rather than hurts it. But one example of where it's not so great is over here on the shoulder, where you can see I have a 3-sided pole right on the shoulder, and it actually is causing a little bit of a lump. I don't know how well you can see that in the video, but right here, if you look at the example file, there is just a little bit of a lump. Now, it's not that bad, and so I'm not too concerned about it. But again, it's that high concentration of vertices all in that area that's causing that lump. And so we might want to go into edit mode and try to smooth this out a little bit and just adjust the surrounding vertices to make sure it's not as concentrated. And so we could do some adjustment there, but overall, kind of no matter what you do, you're going to get a little bit of a lump when you have a pole like that. But it's not inherently bad. Here we're using it to direct the edge loops to go around the body. But having some areas of the model like that is kind of inevitable. But if I were to create this model again, I'd probably want to place that in more of a discrete spot, like maybe over here where it would be a little bit more hidden. But all that to say, poles in the right spot can look great, poles in the wrong spot can look bad. Another thing that I want to point out about subdivision surface modeling and working with different types of topology is that you can kind of think about edges in between vertices as little rubber bands. Here I've just taken a quad and split it up into 2 triangles, and you can see that it's creating a lot of pulling. In areas like down here on the bottom left, we have a vertex that's being pulled equally in all directions, and so it remains perfectly stable and everything is straight. But here in the middle, where it's connected to 5 edges that are not evenly spread out, they're more concentrated in that top right area, and the vertex itself is going to be pulled off center. And you can see that here if we toggle this modifier on and off. So if we really wanted to, we could put this back in the center just by pulling it evenly on the opposite side. I could tab into edit mode, take these 2 opposing vertices on the bottom left face, and hit J to do a vertex connect, and split that quad in half into 2 triangles. Now that vertex is perfectly balanced in the middle, and it's not being weirdly pulled in any direction. Now the 2 corners on the sides of that diagonal are still unbalanced, and so now we've just sort of shifted the stretching into those areas. If I go through and triangulate a bunch of these other faces as well, inside this newly created pattern, everything is actually pretty stable. But on the outside of the pattern, where it's not being pulled evenly in all directions, that's where we're getting that pulling and lumpiness. Next to that, I have an example of where we have a bunch of triangles all combined in the center, and since that vertex is being pulled evenly in all directions, then the result actually looks pretty good. One thing to notice though is that when it comes to triangles, the back of the triangle is always going to bulge out a little bit, and so this inner circle isn't going to be 100% circular. Now this outer circle is 100% circular, and so it's sort of supporting that shape, which is a topic we'll talk about in the next video. But for now, just notice how when we have a few amount of triangles, that bulge isn't really too big of a deal. But if we were to have a bunch of triangles all connected together, for example, if I take a circle, and let's just use the default with 32, and let's merge those all right at the center, add a subdivision surface modifier, E to extrude, scale that out, then you can see that the bulge is much more noticeable. So the more edges that a pole is connected to, the more of these kind of distortions you're going to get. So that's why it's generally recommended to use 5-sided poles when possible, but that's not written on a stone tablet or anything. My more important mantra is if it works, it works. In this next example, we have a bunch of different poles and they're all connected by quads. If we look at the subdivision of this, we can see that there are areas of potential pinching here, 3 where we have those 3-sided poles, and then we also have an area of low density up here, where we had that 5-sided pole. And so using all quads doesn't necessarily ensure that you're going to get a perfectly smooth result. Again, it's just about the distribution of the quads, how evenly spaced they are, and how they all flow together. Lastly, we have a pretty extreme example of how n-gons and lots of triangles together can cause some warping. And another reason to try to avoid stuff like this is if you're going to deform it during animation. So if we look at our simple deform modifier here, these little stretches that resemble an anatomical feature that I won't mention in this video definitely are not ideal. Now this one on the right looks a little bit better because it has another edge loop supporting it, whereas over here, that n-gon is just connected directly to the edge and there's no support next to it. Over here, we do have a little bit of support, so it's a bit better. And if we turn our overlays off, we can't tell any difference. But if we were to go ahead and deform it, then we start to see those issues. So one good reason to use all quads is that pretty much whatever you throw at it when it comes to deformation is going to look perfectly fine. There's always going to be some exceptions, of course, but for the vast majority of cases, quads are going to look a lot better when animated. If you gave an animator one of these meshes, they would probably send it right back. So all quad meshes are great for rounded surfaces and great for deformations. So on flat surfaces, you have a little bit more leeway, but on things that are rounded or are going to be deformed, you should definitely try to stick with more evenly spaced geometry. And remember that working with quads in edit mode is going to allow us to work with edge loops really easily and adjust our geometry in ways that are a lot more intuitive. But the main thing that I want you to get out of this video is that when using the subdivision surface modifier, good topology isn't about quads versus not quads necessarily, though using quads is a good rule of thumb. It's more so about the flow of your edge loops and the density distribution of your vertices.